Welcome to the pilot episode of the Gast podcast, African Policy, Analysis, Aspects. I'm Larissa Pflüger from the German Africa Foundation. Our podcast features conversations with experts and practitioners working on political, social and cultural debates across the African continent, as well as in German-African relations. Today we are taking a closer look at Uganda. In the January general elections, long-serving President Yoweri Museveni was re-elected with about 72% of the vote, defeating his main challenger Bobi Wine. In this episode, we unpack the political dynamics and human rights questions raised by these elections and examine their implications for Uganda domestically, regionally, and internationally. Our guest today is Nicholas Opiyo, a human rights lawyer and 2017 German Africa Award laureate. He is currently living in exile and continues to document human rights violations in Uganda. Thank you for joining us, Nicholas.
Thank you very much.
Before we talk about the recent events, for those who are not that familiar with Uganda, could you briefly explain what kind of political system Uganda has today and what was actually at stake at this election?
So first of all, let me say it's an absolute pleasure to take part in this inaugural podcast for the German African Foundation. Thank you for choosing me to be your first guest. It's a deep honor. I really appreciate it. But for those unfamiliar with Uganda, Uganda is a small, tiny country in East Africa that has had one president in power for the last 40 years. When he took over power in 1986, he promised the country that this would be a fundamental change, to quote his word, not just a mere change of guards. And between the years 1986 and 1996, he embarked on many reforms, including the process of writing a new constitution for the country, a process of enacting many human rights laws, signing up to international human rights instruments. He created a broad-based government that brought together all political parties. He banned the activities of political parties because he wanted to build the country up again. And so for the first 10 years, there were no elections, there was no political party. The country embarked on reforms, of writing a new constitution, but more importantly, of investigating human rights violations in Uganda from 1962, when we got our independence, to 1986. So the country was optimistic. We were buzzing with hope that for the first time, we are going to have a government that would be different from governments of the past. So in 1995, we enacted a new constitution for the country. That constitution provided for an elaborate Bill of Rights, freedoms for Ugandans. New institutions were created to protect human rights and our democratic process.
So, from what I hear in the beginning, there were many reforms. But let's take a look at Museveni's first presidential elections in 1996. How did things evolve afterwards?
In the history of our country, that election was seen as the most fair election the country has ever had. And the country overwhelmingly voted for him. And when the country voted for him, he began to show signs of problems. Because the Constitution provided for two-term presidential limits. In other words, somebody could not contest for the presidency for more than 2 terms. He embarked on a process of removing those limitations. He allowed for return of multi-party politics through a referendum in 2005. Not because he believed in multi-party politics, but because he was under pressure from development partners to open up the space for parties to operate. The following election in 2001 was an election that began to see the use of extreme violence against the oppositions in the country, those who opposed to him. And eventually, he won the election in 2001, and every election in Uganda since 2001 have been witnessed by extreme violence, has been witnessing the arrest of his opponents, the accusations of his opponents of capital offenses. His initial opponent, Kizza Besigye, in 2011 was accused of rape. The courts acquitted him eventually. He was accused of treason. He was arrested numerous times.
You already mentioned constitutional reforms regarding the term limit of the presidency, but those weren't the only reforms.
The Constitution provided that nobody could be president when they're above the age of 75. And so when he was turning 75, he embarked on a process again of manipulating Parliament to amend the Constitution, this time using violence on members of Parliament. For the first time in the history of our country, soldiers beat up members of Parliament on the floor of Parliament for opposing these amendments. And he removed presidential age limits and that allowed him to contest for the presidency after the age of 75. And so the election before the last one was perhaps the most violent because it saw the enforced disappearances of many people who were opposed to his government. Up to now, we have a list of 18 people who are missing, who are taken forcefully by security forces and have never been traced since then. He saw the cases of extreme use of torture against his opponents. Museveni's opponent, Bobi Wine, in the last election, was arrested several times and spent his time between prison and campaign trail. He was also accused of treason. There's an open case that's still ongoing in northern Uganda of treason against Bobi Wine. And so the recent election must be seen against the background of the violence that have characterized Museveni's stay in power since he came to power in 1986.
But not only opposition figures were subject to repressive measures. As we speak, you're not in the country.
In the elections before the last one, I was arrested. I was sent away to jail and accused of money laundering. The real reason for my arrest was not that I was involved in any money laundering, but because we were documenting human rights violations that were happening during the election. We were documenting cases of extrajudicial killings on the streets of the city by the Ugandan government. And they didn't like that, so they arrested me and sent me away to prison. I fought those charges until they dropped all of them. They closed the organization that I started and I was leading called Chapter 4. For 9 months, we were in court fighting for the organization to be reopened. The organization was eventually reopened. Many of my colleagues had their accounts frozen. Development partners, employees of the European Union mission in Uganda were expelled from the country. Employees of international organizations were expelled from the country. And so in that last election was very painful for me. I left the country. I went to stay in the United States for 2.5 years. But in those 2.5 years, my father died. I couldn't bury my father. I buried my father over Zoom. It was deeply painful for me. And so I took the decision to go back to Uganda in 2023 to be able to pay my last respects to my father and find closure. When I went back to Uganda, I thought I would be safe. I resigned my job at Chapter 4, but I continued to feel unsafe in the country. I was being trailed. There were false accusations being made against me by members of the intelligence community. My life was becoming unbearable. So I took the decision again not to be arrested this time. I left the country because I foresaw that the election was going to be characterized by violence and that people were going to be arrested and disappeared. And so I left the country and I'm now in Washington, D.C.
And how did you experience the January elections from afar?
It is very, very heartbreaking to see what's happening in the country. First, because you're unable to do anything about it. If I were in the country, we would be documenting human rights violations. We would be going to court to seek redress for people who are being tortured, people who are being beaten, people who are being extrajudicially killed by the Ugandan state. The president's own son, who is the commander-in-chief, has admitted to killing 20 people, boasting about it on Twitter. There is no justice being pursued for these people. We saw people being disappeared. As of last night, about 1,300 supporters of the National Unity Platform, the party that is opposed to President Museveni, the leading opposition party, had been disappeared. Unmarked vehicles driving neighborhoods, picking up young people, and their crime, supporting those opposed to President Museveni. Civil society organizations have been closed, including our own Chapter 4 that I founded and led. Their licenses have been cancelled by the government on accusations, quote unquote, of being involved in subversive activities. There's no such thing as subversive activities. There were organizations that were involved in democratic accountability in the process of elections. Over 15 organizations. Bobi Wine, the leading opposition candidate, has had his home besieged by armed forces ever since voting day. The army broke into his house in the middle of the night, beat up his wife, beat up his domestic servants, and Bobi Wine has had to go into hiding. He has been in hiding now since January 13. All the meanwhile, the army commander is demanding for his head, dead or alive, and promising to do heinous things to him.
From what you're describing, it seems like repression and violence around elections has been growing over the years. Do you have any explanation for that?
The real reason is that the young people of Uganda has a very young population. More than 78% of our population are people below the age of 35. These are people who were born under President Museveni's rule. They have not seen any other president. But these people don't have jobs. These people are seeing increasing breakdown of social services in the country. These people are witnessing gross economic inequality between those who have access to state power and the population generally. These young people are yearning for a better country. These people are yearning for change. They don't care about what happened before 1986 because they don't know it. All they know is that they compare Uganda with other countries and they see other countries doing better and Uganda, not doing as well as the other countries are doing. They have access to the internet. So they're yearning for change. They're yearning for a better country. Secondly, because the possibility of a peaceful transfer of power has diminished with every election. Elections at the top ballot have become a ritual. There is no doubt that President Museveni will win the election or will declare himself a winner if he's on the ballot. There's no possibility for a peaceful transfer of power. People are becoming frustrated, people are becoming radicalized, especially when they are met with such violence. And unfortunately, the response of the state is not to listen to the complaints of the population, but to unleash violence on them.
Let me jump in here. How did international partners react to the situation?
Development partners that used to hold Uganda to account, at least nominally, condemn Uganda for human rights violations, seems to have taken their eyes away from Uganda. In fact, from most parts of the global south. Violence in elections haven't just been in Uganda. In Tanzania, just a few months ago, widespread violence against the population during elections. And yet we see limited action from the international systems and partners of Uganda. These has emboldened repressive leaders in the global south because there is no repercussion, there's no consequence of their actions. International systems seems to be crumbling. In the last election, employees of international organizations like GIZ were expelled from Uganda. And yet you didn't hear anything from the German government or from the European Union. And so the collapse of that system of accountability has just emboldened the systems in repressive countries to use violence and undemocratic means to retain power.
Could you give us an example?
In the 2021 election, We were involved in documenting cases of human rights violations. We prepared a huge dossier indicating crimes committed by leading government officials. We have 13,000 pieces of evidence collected through open source investigations. We have been sending this evidence to people all around the country, including to German prosecutors, to use the universal jurisdiction system to hold perpetrators of violence in that election accountable. Nothing has been done to date. When you do not raise the cost of human rights violation, you embolden those who are violating these rights, and they will do even worse. And so these collapse, these silence by international partners does not help the situation. And in Uganda, it has made it worse. And we are seeing the consequences of that right now happening.
So what are your expectations toward international partners such as Germany or the European Union going forward?
Look, the European Union, the German government has presence on the ground. There's no excuse to say they do not know what is happening. They have an embassy. They have a European mission in Uganda. They have European country partners with missions in Uganda. It is expected that they know, they see what is happening in Uganda. They meet local actors. They hear from local actors. So they know what's happening. There is therefore no excuse for non-action. First, I think it is important to ensure that your development assistance in Uganda does not go to programs that violate human rights and subvert the democratic process in Uganda. When we see ambassadors posing in photographs with the army commander who has publicly promised to behead President Museveni's opponents, who has posted videos of torture in what he calls his basement of supporters of Bobi Wine, who has been involved in many cases, threatening these very ambassadors, who begin to wonder what it is that they are doing with such an individual. There's a very embarrassing video that happened last year. The entire European Union group of ambassadors went to northern Uganda to meet President Museveni's brother, who is not even a government official. And so you have to be able to take a posture of concern against individuals and systems who are involved in human rights violations. Speak up against these violations. Your silence in the name of quiet diplomacy clearly has shown that quiet diplomacy has not helped in any way to shape the conduct of the regime in Kampala. Take a posture of concern, not a posture of compliance. Secondly, there are instruments within the reach of the European partners that can be deployed. The European Parliament passed the Global Magnitsky Act to ensure accountability for human rights violations across the world. They have not deployed these instruments. Laser-targeted sanctions against individuals involved in violations of rights must be triggered, as opposed to targeting the entire country. Because if you sanction the entire country, you're causing problems to those who are victims. You're re-victimizing victims. But individuals who are most responsible for violations of rights, for subverting the democratic practice of the country, must have consequences. These instruments, both financial and political, must be invoked.
You have already mentioned the army commander, who's also the president's son, several times. There are some rumors that he will succeed his father one day. In your opinion, is there any truth to these rumors? And what are the consequences looking at Uganda's state of democracy?
First, I think it is important to highlight that ever since 1962, when Uganda attained independence from the British, Uganda has never had a peaceful transfer of power. President Museveni is now over 80 years old. He hasn't got much time left. People are asking him to do the right thing and show a peaceful transfer of power. But what do we see? We see an attempt to hang on to power for as long as he can, for as long as he physically can. But we also see processes that initially were dismissed many years ago when somebody who was the coordinator of intelligence services wrote a letter and said there was a project being framed by President Museveni to make his son his successor. That army general was sent away to exile for fear of his life. The newspaper that published the story about what was called the Muhoozi project was closed for a whole week and ransacked, and there was denial of that no such project exists. And yet, many years down the road, we are now seeing that same project unfold. There's no doubt that President Museveni's son wants to succeed his father. He has expressed this himself publicly. Through his tweets, he now calls himself the next generational leader. He has formed a political pressure group called the PLU, the Patriotic League of Uganda, that had threatened to contest for presidency in the last election. So the idea of President Museveni's son succeeding his father has now been conscientized in the minds of the people. People are now beginning to expect it because it appears every effort is being made to ensure that that happens. And to be fair to the young man, he has a right to contest for the presidency, like anybody in Uganda. What is contested by many people is what seems to be a process to enthrone him, as opposed to a process of somebody fairly contesting for an election. If he wants to contest for elections, let him resign from the army. Let him not use and abuse state resources and processes to his advantage. Let him come to the field and play by the rules of the field. Now, the consequence of this is that when you have elections not being a means people trust for a peaceful transfer of power, people get radicalized. When you have the state responding with violence, people get further radicalized. And when you see an attempt to try and impose the president's son on all of the Ugandan people, you will begin to see a pathway to violence. You're going to see a pathway to conflict. You begin to see fissures of ethnic tensions in the country because people who come from the part of the country where Museveni comes from are now collectively being perceived as unfairly benefiting from the system, and people beginning to use ethnic language towards them. These are early signs of violence. Genocide doesn't begin on one day. It begins by the demonizing of a particular ethnic group. And when people have the chance, people will pounce on them.
And what does that mean in a broader context, for example, looking at an international level?
For many of the Uganda development partners, I know that the European Union and European Union member states have large investments in Uganda, in the economy of Uganda, defense cooperation. All of this will be at risk. A German company investing in Uganda will understand that you need a fair justice system if you are investing in Uganda. I give you an example of Kawere Coffee, a German coffee farm in Kampala that got itself embroiled in a land conflict over a coffee farm for more than 15 years. That German company knows the impact of an unfair justice system. That German company knows the impact of an unpredictable tax system, an unpredictable country. So your investments in Uganda will be at risk. Long-term interests, as I said before, can only be served by a more democratic country, by a more predictable system, by a peaceful country.
Let us now look at a regional level. You have already mentioned Tanzania's elections last year. which have been characterized by violence as well. Both Ethiopia and Kenya are heading to the ballots soon. What impact has Uganda's election on the regional stability?
Look, regional stability will be threatened. Kenya goes into an election. Just this weekend, the former Kenyan vice president was attacked in a church while praying. Innocent people who were in a church were tear gassed, were beaten. We've had cases of people being shot and killed on the streets of Nairobi. We've had cases of Kenyan authorities arresting and unlawfully re-auditioning opposition leaders of other countries in the region. Right now, Dr. Kizza Besigye in Uganda sits in prison for over a year. He was arrested in Kenya by the Kenyan authority and unlawfully re-auditioned to Uganda, where he's being charged with treason. He's been in prison for the last 1 year with his friends and colleagues without being tried. Tanzanian opposition leaders who are going into Tanzania to go and witness a trial of their colleague were arrested and sent back to Kenya. Ugandan activists like Agatha Tohaire, who had gone to Tanzania, were arrested in Tanzania, sexually abused, and sent back to Uganda. Clearly, the practice of repression in East Africa is being adopted. I think the leaders are working together in their tactics to repress their own people. There was shutdown of the internet in Tanzania. In Uganda as well, there was shutdown of the internet. I'm sure in Kenya there will be disruptions as well. So these undemocratic practices seems to be shared amongst leaders of the region.
You brought up the withdrawal of international partners regarding pointing out human rights violations, both in Uganda but also in the region. What would you tell partners? Why is it important to continuing standing up for human rights?
The withdrawal or the non-action of the traditional Western allies of their former colonies creates an opportunity for malevolent actors such as Russia, such as China, to occupy that space. And they, as history will show us, don't care about human rights and democratic practices. So you'll be losing your spheres of influence, your leverage of power, your international supporters, that eventually hurt your own interests. So it is really in the enlightened self-interest of Western countries to continue engaging with the global South, to avoid these regions falling into the hands of actors such as Russia and China. In places where this has happened, you begin to see the infiltration of private militias like the Wagner Group from Russia. You begin to see the growing infiltration of terrorist fundamentalist groups occupying those areas because the people are radicalized. The people don't see any other way of survival than to involve in violence. And so this is really important for regional stability and for global stability. Lastly, the refugee crisis, the immigration crisis in the world. Many people who are fleeing into the West are not fleeing natural disasters or there is an outbreak of Ebola. No, they're fleeing political violence. And for as long as you don't address the root cause of that migration process, the creators, the drivers of that migration process, the people who are running away from their own countries will end up at your borders and become a burden on you. They will wash up on your shores. Many African young people who are supposed to stay in their country and be productive are risking their lives to go to the sea to try and, in rickety boats using smugglers, get into Europe. Not because they don't want to come and stay in their countries, but because the political environment in their country is unbearable. And so it is in the global interests of these countries to ensure that there's political stability, there's economic prosperity, there is peace in the global South.
Before we now close, Nicholas, I'd like to shift the focus slightly. When you think about Uganda, what gives you hope for its future?
Look, the young people in Uganda are a source of inspiration. are a source of hope for our country because they're standing up. They're beginning to realize that what is at stake is their own future and that they must take part in shaping that future. The civic consciousness amongst young people in Uganda gives me a lot of hope that in spite of what is going on, there might be light at the end of the tunnel. That in spite of the violence that they are facing, they still stand up and show up. They have refused to accept the mantra that they're leaders of the future, but that they're leaders of today who must get involved in shaping their own future. That gives me hope. The second thing is that we have to keep an eye on the private sector. The private sector will lose the most if the country descends into violence because they have investments in the country. They are going to have to begin to take an active role in ensuring a conducive economic environment for their businesses in the country. And I hope and pray that they begin to see this and begin to take part in shaping the future of Uganda. Uganda is a beautiful country. We have summer throughout the year. It's green, it's fertile. We can be an economic hub for the region. We can be a food basket for the entire region and the world. We are now the largest exporter of coffee in the world. How much more could we do if that country was peaceful? How much more could we do if that country was being properly governed?
Thank you very much, Nicholas, for joining us and sharing your insights.
Thank you very much.
That was the pilot episode of Das Podcast, African Policy, Analysis, Aspekte. If you enjoyed this episode, please let us know and share with others. To stay updated on upcoming episodes, follow us on social media. Thanks for listening.